January 1945, Western Germany. Winter has tightened its grip on the land. Snow lies packed hard along a narrow road where an American field aid station has been set up inside a damaged farmhouse. Canvas flaps stir in the wind. The smell of antiseptic mixes with wood smoke and wet wool. Outside, engines idle low. Inside, silence dominates. A German woman sits on a wooden bench under guard. Her coat is thin. Her boots are soaked. She keeps her eyes lowered, not from defiance, but from exhaustion. When she removes her gloves, the room stills. Her hands are swollen, the skin stretched, pale in places, dark in others. Fingers barely bend. Pain pulses beneath numbness. She has crossed from civilian life into captivity in a matter of hours. The front moved faster than she could. One army collapsed. Another arrived. She does not speak English. The medics do not speak German. Yet the meaning is clear. She believes what many before her have believed in wartime hospitals, that she will leave without her hands. Outside, artillery sounds roll faintly across the frozen fields. Inside, an American medic steps closer, studies the damage, and reaches for his instruments. The war has already taken much from her. What happens next will decide how much more it will take. By January 1945, the war in Europe had entered its final, most destructive phase. The Allied advance from the West had crossed into Germany itself. After the breakout from Normandy in the summer of 1944, American, British, and Canadian forces had pushed relentlessly across France and Belgium. Paris had fallen in August. By autumn, Allied columns were pressing toward the Rhine. Germany's borders, once distant from the Western Front, were now exposed. The German state was unraveling under pressure from every direction. In the east, the Red Army was driving westward with overwhelming force. In the west, U.S. Army units, supported by vast logistical networks and air supremacy, were advancing town by town, road by road. The Ardennes counteroffensive in December 1944 had temporarily slowed the Allied momentum, but it failed at catastrophic cost. By early January, American forces had regained lost ground and resumed their eastward push. Winter made everything worse. The winter of 1944-1945 was among the coldest of the war. Snowstorms, freezing rain, and sub-zero temperatures gripped Central Europe. Roads iced over. Rivers swelled and froze. Civilians fled ahead of the front lines, often with little more than what they could carry. Food shortages were severe. Medical care inside Germany was collapsing under the strain of bomb damage, loss of supplies, and overwhelmed hospitals. Women were no longer distant from the fighting. By this stage of the war, German women were everywhere in the conflict zone. Some served as auxiliaries in communications or logistics. Others worked in factories, farms, or transport. Many were simply civilians caught between collapsing defenses and advancing armies. As towns changed hands, women were swept into captivity alongside wounded soldiers, Volkssturm militia, and displaced civilians. Capture no longer followed neat rules. U.S. forces were taking prisoners at an unprecedented rate. Entire units surrendered. Civilians were detained for screening. Makeshift collection points appeared in villages, barns, schools, and damaged homes. Among the prisoners were women, some uniformed, many not. Exhausted, injured, and terrified of what captivity might bring. Rumors traveled faster than facts. Stories of revenge, mistreatment, and disappearance spread among civilians fleeing the front. German propaganda had long painted Allied forces as brutal occupiers. For women, fear was magnified. Injury meant vulnerability. Dependency meant uncertainty. For those suffering severe wounds or exposure, time was critical. Frostbite, burns, shrapnel injuries, and untreated infections were common. Hands and feet were especially at risk. Circulation failed in the cold. Tissue died quietly, often without immediate pain. By the time damage became visible, amputation was frequently the only option German doctors could offer, if doctors were available at all. This was the world the German woman entered when she was taken under American control. A world where survival often depended not on nationality, but on how quickly one reached competent medical care. Ahead of her lay not a prison camp, but an American aid station, one node in a vast medical system that had been built to keep soldiers alive and now faced the moral reality of treating the enemy as well. And that system had rules of its own. The US Army did not arrive in Germany unprepared for mass human suffering. By 1945, the American military medical system was the most extensive and organized the world had ever seen. It had been built for scale, millions of men mobilized, thousands of miles from home fighting in extreme conditions. What made it remarkable was not only its size, but its doctrine. Wounded soldiers were to be treated as quickly as possible, moved efficiently, and given the best chance to return to life, if not to combat. This system did not stop at the front line. Forward aid stations operated just behind combat units. They were crude by civilian standards, often set up in barns, schools, cellars, or damaged homes. But they were staffed by trained medics, surgeons, and nurses who followed strict triage protocols. Wounds were assessed not by rank or nationality, but by urgency. Bleeding came first. Shock came next. Infection and exposure followed close behind. The Geneva Convention governed the treatment of prisoners of war. By regulation, wounded enemy personnel were to receive the same medical care as friendly forces. In practice, this rule was tested daily under battlefield pressure. Supplies were limited, beds were scarce, time was precious, yet the directive remained treat the wound, not the uniform. By the winter of 1945, American medics had become accustomed to treating German casualties. They had treated Luftwaffe pilots pulled from wreckage, infantrymen captured in frozen foxholes, and civilians caught in artillery fire. Language barriers were common. Trust was rare. Fear was constant. For women, the situation carried added complexity. Many American medics had never treated female prisoners before entering Germany. The European war had been framed for years as a conflict between male armies. Now, women arrived at aid stations suffering from the same injuries: frostbite, burns, blast trauma, but carrying the additional weight of vulnerability in captivity. Army regulations required female guards and careful handling, but conditions often forced improvisation. Hands were among the most challenging injuries medics faced in winter warfare. Frostbite could destroy tissue without obvious signs at first. Circulation failure led to swelling, discoloration, and numbness. If rewarming was done improperly, damage could worsen. Infection could set in quickly. In many cases earlier in the war, especially on the Eastern Front, amputation had been the standard outcome. It was fast. It prevented gangrene. It saved lives at the cost of limbs. American medical doctrine had begun to change that calculus. By late 1944, U.S. Army medics had accumulated hard-earned experience treating cold injuries in Italy, France, and the Ardennes. Controlled rewarming, careful monitoring, and delayed surgical decisions were increasingly favored. The goal was no longer speed alone, but preservation, saving function when possible. When the German woman was brought into the aid station, her hands told a familiar story to the men who examined them. Severe exposure, prolonged cold, delayed treatment. The danger was real. Tissue loss was possible. The risk of permanent damage was high. But the decision was not yet made. In that narrow space between collapse and care, between enemy and patient, the war paused long enough for medicine to take control. And it is within that pause that the story fractures into different perspectives, each revealing something essential about how wars are fought and how humanity survives inside them. Pain does not announce itself loudly in cases like hers. It arrives quietly, wrapped in numbness. The woman's hands had endured hours, possibly days, of cold exposure before she reached American lines. In extreme cold, the body sacrifices extremities first. Blood flow narrows, sensation fades. By the time pain returns, damage has already begun. Swelling, stiffness, discoloration, these were signs she could see even if she could no longer fully feel them. For her, the fear was not abstract. Hands were not symbols, they were survival. They meant work, food, dignity, independence. In wartime Germany, hands meant labor, on farms, in factories, in rubble-strewn streets. To lose them was not simply to be injured. It was to be erased from usefulness in a country already collapsing. Captured and unable to communicate, she watched faces instead, the set of a jaw, the speed of movements. Whether the men examining her seemed hurried or careful, every gesture mattered. Every pause stretched longer than the last. She had likely seen what untreated injuries led to. She had likely known people who did not come back from hospitals at all. For the American medic, this was not an exceptional case. That was the burden of experience. He had seen hands like these before, on infantrymen pulled from foxholes, on drivers stranded in snow, on paratroopers cut off during the Ardennes fighting. The signs were familiar. The decisions were never easy. Doctrine guided him, but judgment ruled the moment. Immediate amputation was no longer the automatic answer. Not unless there was clear necrosis or advancing infection. The hands had to be warmed, slowly, carefully. Circulation had to be assessed. Color changes monitored. Pain returning was a sign of life, not danger. The medic knew that mistakes here would echo for decades in the patient's body. Rewarm too fast, and tissue could collapse. Delay too long, and gangrene could set in. Each action balanced risk against hope. Her status as a prisoner did not alter the calculation. In training, they had been taught to ignore the uniform. In practice, exhaustion sometimes challenged that ideal. But the hands in front of him were human hands. They obeyed the same biological rules as any others. By 1945, cold injury treatment had evolved through brutal trial. Earlier in the war, frostbite had been treated aggressively, often surgically. But studies and battlefield observation had shown that tissue could recover if given time. American medics increasingly used controlled rewarming, elevation, antiseptic care, and delayed surgery. Hands, in particular, were complex. Fingers could appear dead and later recover function. Swelling did not always mean loss. Pain, when it returned, often meant blood flow had resumed. The decision was never immediate. It required patience, a rare commodity in war. And patience was exactly what this case demanded. As the medics prepared the next steps, the outcome remained uncertain. The war had brought her here. Science would decide what stayed with her. The room grew quieter as the work began, and each perspective, patient, medic, method, tightened toward the same fragile point of no return. Treating enemy wounded is simple on paper, complicated in practice. In 1945, few Americans doubted the legitimacy of the Geneva Convention's mandate: provide care regardless of uniform or nationality. Yet the reality on the ground was more nuanced. Resources were stretched thin. Medics faced long hours, freezing conditions, and constant danger from artillery or ambush. Every bandage, every syringe, was a choice between helping an ally or aiding an enemy. For the woman in front of them, morality transcended ideology. She had been raised to see the Americans as invaders. To trust them was almost unthinkable. Yet the medic's hands worked with calm precision. His actions, removing layers of clothing, examining swollen joints, applying gentle warmth, spoke louder than words. In that small room, ethics became tangible: care without judgment, humanity without bias. Army regulations shaped the medic's actions. Orders were clear: treat all wounded according to severity, not nationality. The U.S. Army had spent years codifying triage, evacuation, and surgical priorities. Policies extended to women and civilians when captured. Yet implementation required flexibility. Forward aid stations were improvisational spaces, staffed by medics trained for speed, not comfort. Supervising officers had to balance battlefield priorities against protocol, ensuring that no action would compromise operational readiness. Every decision carried risk, medical, strategic, and political. In this case, the command's policies allowed medics to devote time to the woman's hands. The system's efficiency created the opportunity for her survival. Without structure, without a regulated chain of care, the outcome might have been far worse. War fractures trust. Fear and suspicion are instinctive. The woman's gaze, the medic's caution, the quiet of the room, all reflected a silent negotiation. Each measured movement, each careful touch, slowly reconstructed a fragile bond between captor and captive. Psychologists today note that extreme stress heightens sensitivity to perceived threats and kindness alike. For the woman, the tactile reassurance of professional hands was transformative. For the medic, observing recovery in real time reinforced the moral imperatives of his role. Together, these perspectives converge: humanity, professionalism, and ethical duty intersect at a single point. A room in a German farmhouse, January 1945, where the fate of two hands would ripple far beyond the immediate moment. In the shadows of war, decisions like this define not battles, but the essence of human decency under fire. And now, the pivotal moment approached, the point where all preparation, patience, and moral resolve would be tested. The room was silent, except for the quiet hiss of a portable stove and the low murmur of instruments being laid out. The woman's hands rested on a small wooden table, pale and swollen, fingers slightly curled, as if clinging to something invisible. Each movement sent a shock of pain through her forearms, but she said nothing. There were no words exchanged, none were needed. The medic crouched beside her, examining each finger, noting the mottled discoloration. Purple and grey patches where circulation had nearly ceased. Blisters had formed on the knuckles, the skin felt waxy, almost fragile to touch. Frostbite had advanced far, yet not uniformly. Some tissue retained warmth and responsiveness, signaling a slim hope of survival. Time was critical. Every minute that passed risked irreversible tissue death. Yet, rushing a decision could condemn her to the operating table unnecessarily. The medic's training held one rule above all: observe, assess, then act. He began controlled rewarming, slowly immersing her hands in tepid water. A thermometer hovered nearby. The temperature could not exceed a safe limit. Too cold and circulation remained blocked. Too hot and tissue could rupture. Slowly, her hands pinked in places, returning pulse and faint sensation. The woman's eyes widened slightly, a mixture of relief and terror. As warmth crept into fingers she feared she would never move again. The medic took a step back. He weighed the risks. Immediate amputation could save her life if infection set in, but it would permanently take her hands. Conservative care might salvage function. Yet failure could lead to gangrene, systemic infection, or death. This was a balance of life and loss, played out on fingertips, every second stretched into eternity. The battlefield outside, the artillery echoes, the frozen roads, they all faded in significance. Here, in this farmhouse-turned-aid station, the war's most intimate fight unfolded: survival versus surrender, flesh versus fate, hands versus history. He made his choice. Patience, observation, gentle care, each bandage, each careful movement, became an act of deliberate resistance against the harsh arithmetic of war. The moment of potential loss transformed into a tense waiting game, as fragile tissue began the slow, uncertain process of revival. The first stage of treatment was over, but the true test had only just begun. How would her hands respond? Would the tissue recover enough to save function? Every heartbeat, every twitch of a finger, now carried the weight of her future. The hours passed in the dim light of the farmhouse aid station. The medic never left her side, monitoring the temperature of the water baths, checking circulation, and documenting subtle changes in swelling and color. Outside, the winter wind rattled the building's thin walls. The faint boom of distant artillery reminded everyone that the war continued, indifferent to individual suffering. As warmth returned to her hands, the first signs of movement appeared. Fingers twitched hesitantly, stiffly, but unmistakably. The woman's eyes, wide with apprehension, followed every action. For her, these small gestures were monumental victories. A heartbeat, a pulse, a flicker of sensation. Each twitch was a fragile assertion that she had not yet lost herself entirely. The medic consulted with a field surgeon via radio. Supplies were limited, but sterile dressings, antiseptics, and splints were available. They opted for delayed surgery, remove only the dead tissue and preserve as much as possible. It was a painstaking process, delicate and slow, carried out with precise instruments under cold, makeshift conditions. Pain management was minimal but effective, using morphine carefully dosed to reduce suffering while maintaining alertness for sensory feedback in the hands. As the procedure continued, every action had stakes. One misjudged incision could destroy the fragile tissue still alive. One delayed application of antiseptic could invite infection. Yet the medic and surgeon worked with steady hands, honed by countless battlefield wounds. The woman, conscious and trembling, remained passive but alert. Her fear did not diminish, it sharpened focus. She understood the stakes, even through the language barrier. Hours later, the operation concluded. Her hands were bandaged, swollen but intact. Fingers could move, joints retained function, and most of the tissue had been preserved. She flexed her hands tentatively, testing them, relief and disbelief washing across her face. She had survived what she feared most: the loss of her hands, her agency, her ability to continue in a world already fractured by war. Outside, the sound of artillery faded as night fell over the snow-covered fields. The war still raged, but inside that small aid station, humanity had held its ground. A woman who had expected to lose the very tools of her survival now clutched them, alive, a living testament to skill, patience, and compassion. Her recovery was not complete, but the turning point had been reached. She would live to see the aftermath of the war, to remember the hands that saved her, and to bear witness to an act of mercy amid chaos. The days that followed were quieter, but no less critical. The German woman remained in the aid station as medics continued her care. Bandages were changed regularly, wounds monitored for infection, and her hands were gently exercised to prevent stiffness. Every tiny movement, The curling of a finger, the press of a thumb, became a measure of progress, a signal that the delicate intervention had succeeded. Outside, the front continued to advance. Towns changed hands, roads filled with refugees, and artillery fire remained a constant backdrop. Yet within the farmhouse, the world shrank to a single, vital concern: healing. Her status as a prisoner remained unchanged, but the treatment she received transcended politics and fear. The medics' actions adhered strictly to army regulations. Wounded enemy personnel were to receive care equal to that of American soldiers. Medical records from the field note similar cases: women captured at the front, suffering frostbite or blast injuries, who would have faced amputation in Germany due to resource scarcity. U.S. field hospitals, equipped with sterilization procedures, antiseptics, and trained personnel, offered a rare chance for limb preservation. For many, it was not just survival, it was a return to function, dignity, and identity. She began regaining strength slowly. Fingers that had barely bent began to flex more fully. Circulation improved. The pallor of frostbite gave way to ruddy warmth. Pain remained, a constant reminder of the trauma endured, but it was manageable, measured, and controlled. Each day, her trust in the medics grew, subtle but palpable, a silent acknowledgement that despite the uniforms and banners, human compassion could exist even amid the machinery of war. Nearby, other prisoners experienced similar interventions. Some did not survive. Infection, malnutrition, and the brutality of cold claimed many. Those who did survive often bore permanent scars. Her case, however, would be recorded as a success, a rare instance where careful observation, patience, and skill preserved both life and function under extreme conditions. The U.S. Army's policy of humane treatment extended beyond protocol. It became a form of soft power, demonstrating to the civilian population and to prisoners themselves that mercy was a tangible, lived experience, even in the chaos of conflict. For the woman, the immediate consequence was clear: she had hands. Not perfect, not fully healed, but hers to carry forward. Recovery would continue in stages. She would be moved to a larger facility for follow-up care, monitored for complications, and eventually processed as a prisoner for the remainder of the conflict. But the most critical stage, the moment where life hung in balance, had passed. Weeks turned into months. The war moved relentlessly forward, but the German woman's life unfolded along a different timeline, one defined by healing, adaptation, and survival. After initial recovery in the field hospital, she was transferred to a larger medical facility behind the front lines. Surgeons continued to monitor circulation, treat minor infections, and begin physical therapy to restore range of motion. Every day was a careful balance between progress and patience. Her hands, once on the brink of permanent loss, regained function. Some stiffness remained, some scars marked her skin, but she could grasp, hold, and work. For a woman who had feared her life would be defined by incapacity, this was extraordinary. Testimonies from medics in similar cases show that such recoveries were far from guaranteed. Frostbite, combined with delayed treatment, often resulted in partial or total amputation. Her survival was both a testament to skill and an exception in the harsh arithmetic of war. The broader implications were also significant. The U.S. Army's approach to enemy medical care reinforced the principles of the Geneva Convention in real time. Field medics, often young men barely out of training, became daily exemplars of how ethics could intersect with survival. Their actions left lasting impressions on those they treated, soldiers and civilians alike. Former POWs would recount their experiences decades later, highlighting the unexpected humanity shown by those officially their captors. The psychological dimension cannot be understated. Survivors like her carried complex memories, fear of combat, shock at captivity, and gratitude for care that transcended nationality. These experiences shaped post-war interactions between Americans and Germans. Humanitarian acts on the battlefield built bridges in ways that diplomacy alone could not. They became quiet but powerful reminders that even amid mass destruction, moral choices mattered. For the U.S. Army, these cases also offered lessons in medical doctrine. Controlled rewarming, delayed amputation, and meticulous observation became standard practice for treating frostbite and other cold-related injuries. Field manuals incorporated these experiences, saving countless hands, feet, and lives in the final months of the European campaign and beyond. In her small recovery room, the war's abstract violence gave way to personal triumph. A human story, nested within the vast machinery of battle, revealed the delicate interplay of skill, patience, and morality. What happened to her hands would outlast the battlefield, outlast the occupation, and outlast the fear that had once made her believe she would lose herself entirely. In war, hands are more than instruments. They are symbols of agency, survival, and identity. To lose them is to lose not just a limb, but a means of shaping one's life. The German woman's ordeal reminds us that the smallest victories in war are often invisible on maps or absent from strategy reports. They are measured in pulses restored, tissue saved, and the fragile trust between captor and captive. Her survival was the product of expertise, patience, and an unwavering adherence to humanitarian principles. The medic's care demonstrated that even amidst the machinery of destruction, human skill and moral courage could preserve life in its most elemental form. Their actions were neither heroic in the cinematic sense nor grand in scale, but they were profound in consequence. They allowed her to keep her hands, and with them, her future. History often records battles, treaties, and political maneuvers. Yet it is in moments like these, quiet and precise, where the moral and practical dimensions of war intersect. The war continued outside the walls of the farmhouse, consuming armies and nations, but within it, mercy found a foothold. This small act became a testament to what wartime humanity could achieve when guided by knowledge, ethics, and compassion. The story of a woman who thought she would lose her hands survives, not because of the war she endured, but because of the care she received. It endures as a reminder that even in the darkest chapters of human history, the quiet interventions, the attentive hands of a medic, the patient application of skill can alter lives forever. In the end, war may take much, but humanity, when exercised with courage and precision, can give back what seemed lost.